When Karen called in a fake HOA enforcement team to bully her neighbors over a minor fence dispute, she thought she had the upper hand. But in her desperate attempt to control the block, she didn't realize one thing: she was about to get caught in her own trap. What happens when the manipulator becomes the exposed? The answer turned an entire neighborhood upside down. In many suburban communities governed by a homeowners association, HOA, neighborhood disputes are often mediated through formal channels, particularly when it comes to issues like property boundaries, exterior aesthetics, or fence installations. What began as a routine disagreement over a simple fence extension in one such neighborhood, however, quickly escalated into a full-blown power struggle driven by personal bias, an exaggerated sense of authority, and a deep desire to control. At the center of this growing conflict stood Karen, a resident long known for her strict interpretations of HOA guidelines and her persistent monitoring of others' compliance. The situation initially appeared minor. A young couple had recently installed a wooden privacy fence that extended just a few feet beyond the usual alignment with neighboring fences. While the construction was visually clean and practical for pet containment and backyard privacy, Karen took immediate offense. She argued that the fence violated HOA setback rules and disrupted the visual harmony of the street. Rather than raise the concern through regular channels such as submitting a written complaint to the actual HOA board or requesting a review by a neighborhood committee, she launched her own informal campaign. Karen had long positioned herself as the unofficial rule enforcer of the block. Known for leaving passive-aggressive notes about trash bins, lawn height, and mailbox maintenance, she often claimed to have a deeper knowledge of HOA bylaws than anyone else. Her interpretations, however, frequently differed from those actually outlined in the community's governing documents. In the case of a fence, her objections were not rooted in any current violation, but in a clause that applied only to corner lots, something that did not apply to the couple's home. Despite this, Karen insisted the fence was non-compliant and should be torn down or modified. The HOA board had already reviewed and approved the fence prior to installation, with permits filed and guidelines followed. Karen either disregarded this information or chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, she intensified her efforts by pressuring other neighbors to support her stance, distributing printouts of outdated HOA language, and suggesting that failure to address this violation would lead to property devaluation across the block. While some neighbors politely agreed to avoid conflict, most quietly ignored the issue, recognizing it as another one of Karen's exaggerated concerns. Feeling undermined and increasingly frustrated, Karen began taking matters into her own hands. She started documenting the fence from multiple angles, measuring its distance from property lines and logging dates and times when the homeowners used their backyard. Her fixation with the fence evolved into a personal mission that extended beyond any reasonable response to a perceived infraction. This shift from policy to personal vendetta marked a critical turning point. Karen's obsession with HOA rules wasn't just about community standards, it was about power. Her actions demonstrated a desire not just to ensure fairness, but to assert dominance over others in the neighborhood. The fence dispute became a convenient outlet for these control impulses, allowing her to cloak personal grievances in the language of policy enforcement. Her insistence that the fence was a major violation, despite all evidence to the contrary, became symbolic of a broader pattern of behavior where personal preferences were framed as objective rules. As Karen encountered resistance from both the homeowners and the official HOA, she began seeking alternative ways to force compliance. She circulated rumors that the homeowners had bypassed approval, claiming they used loopholes to get the fence approved. She contacted the city building inspector's office in hopes of finding a technical violation, only to discover the permits were in order. Each failed attempt only seemed to fuel her determination further. The tension in the neighborhood grew. A once quiet street became fractured by suspicion and frustration. Some residents began questioning whether HOA rules were being applied fairly or selectively, while others grew increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's persistent monitoring and accusatory tone. The fence, still standing and legally approved, became a symbol of resistance, not just against arbitrary enforcement, but against one resident's unchecked influence. Eventually, The situation reached a point where Karen could no longer influence outcomes through conventional means. Her complaints had been dismissed, her interpretations had been challenged, and the HOA refused to reverse its approval. But instead of moving on, Karen escalated. She began referencing new, unnamed officials who would soon be handling the matter more seriously. She claimed that the HOA had called in higher authorities to take action against the homeowners. This vague but ominous statement confused many until individuals posing as HOA enforcement agents began showing up at various properties in the neighborhood. At first, it wasn't clear who they were or why they were issuing warnings about fences, landscaping, and exterior decor. They wore uniforms, carried clipboards, and issued printed citations, but something felt off. For those paying attention, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Karen's fence feud hadn't just stirred controversy. It had planted the seeds for something much more sinister. What began as a simple dispute over a backyard fence had evolved into a battleground for control and manipulation. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about revenge, influence, and a willingness to cross the line when power was threatened. The fence was still standing, but the neighborhood was about to learn just how far someone would go to take it down. In the weeks following Karen's escalating campaign against the newly installed fence, an unusual development unfolded that caught the neighborhood by surprise. Individuals posing as members of an HOA enforcement division began making unannounced visits to homes across the block. Wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with what appeared to be an official HOA crest, they carried clipboards, issued citations, and referenced obscure bylaw sections while speaking in an authoritative manner. For many residents, their arrival created a sense of confusion and unease. These individuals conducted themselves with the confidence and demeanor of official agents. They introduced themselves as compliance officers conducting a routine inspection sweep ordered by the HOA board. The alleged reason was an increase in neighborhood violations, including improper fence installations, non-compliant paint colors, excessive lawn ornamentation, unauthorized structures, and even neglected shrubbery. The citations they issued often came with warnings of escalating fines if corrections were not made within specific time frames, sometimes as short as 48 hours. What initially appeared to be a genuine effort at community enforcement soon began to raise questions. The HOA had never publicly announced such a program. No emails, newsletters, or meeting minutes referenced a new enforcement division. In fact, the HOA's own charter did not authorize the existence of a roaming compliance team. Normally, violations were handled via written notice sent through mail or official HOA correspondence, not surprise visits by unfamiliar individuals demanding immediate explanations or corrective actions. Despite these irregularities, the early encounters with the supposed enforcers succeeded in intimidating a number of residents. The authoritative tone, formal-looking documents, and professional attire created a convincing image. Many homeowners, uncertain of their rights or the legitimacy of the citations, complied out of fear. Some began removing garden fixtures, repainting trim, or adjusting fences, even when no actual violations had occurred. The pressure to conform was compounded by veiled threats that repeated infractions could result in legal consequences or increased HOA dues. One of the tactics employed by the imposters involved quoting non-existent bylaws or twisting the language of real ones beyond their original intent. For example, they frequently cited rules about uniform aesthetic continuity, a vague phrase that allowed them to challenge a broad range of personal choices from patio furniture to driveway placement. The ambiguity of their references made it difficult for residents to dispute the claims in the moment. Even those who suspected something wasn't right often lacked the documentation or familiarity with the HOA's actual rules to challenge the citations confidently. As the visits continued, certain patterns emerged. The enforcers appeared to focus on homes that Karen had previously complained about, either directly in meetings or indirectly in neighborhood discussions. These included the couple with the fence, as well as others who had recently undertaken renovations, installed visible lawn equipment, or disagreed with Karen on HOA matters. The apparent targeting raised concerns among neighbors, who began to quietly compare notes about the timing, nature, and frequency of visits. The impersonators typically avoided engaging with multiple homeowners at once and often arrived during the mid-morning or early afternoon when many residents were at work. This made it difficult for people to share immediate feedback or verify others' experiences. The use of printed forms, complete with citation numbers and official-sounding titles, further added to the illusion. The documents frequently included vague instructions such as restore visual harmony within 72 hours or remove unapproved exterior modifications. While no legitimate contact information was listed, residents were given prepaid envelopes and encouraged to submit payments or documentation without questioning the process. Despite the professionalism of the scam's presentation, minor inconsistencies began to raise suspicions. Some residents noted that the names on the citations didn't match actual board members. Others pointed out that the cited rule numbers didn't exist in the HOA handbook. Additionally, when a few homeowners contacted the HOA directly to inquire about the fines, they were told no such enforcement initiative was underway. These red flags slowly began to erode the credibility of the so-called enforcement division. The impersonators never produced verifiable credentials, nor did they allow residents to photograph them or record their conversations. When asked for identification or the name of the board member who authorized their visit, they deflected or provided ambiguous responses. On several occasions, residents reported that the enforcers grew visibly irritated when challenged, insisting that refusal to comply would result in escalated action. This aggressive behavior further fueled concerns that something was seriously wrong. As more residents began to share experiences and compare details, it became clear that the enforcement group was not only unofficial, but likely part of a coordinated effort to manipulate and intimidate the neighborhood under false pretenses. The professional uniforms, printed citations, and structured visits suggested significant planning. Combined with the pattern of selectively targeted homes, particularly those tied to Karen's prior grievances, it became increasingly difficult to view the situation as anything other than deliberate and malicious. The arrival of the fake enforcers had created a false sense of urgency and fear, disrupting the community's normal rhythm and placing pressure on individuals to act out of panic rather than reason. The credibility of the HOA, already under strain due to prior controversies, suffered further as confusion spread about who was responsible and what was legitimate. While the full truth had yet to surface, the foundation of the fraud had been laid bare, a calculated effort to exploit the appearance of authority to settle personal scores and exert control. As suspicions surrounding the fake HOA enforcers intensified, attention within the neighborhood began to shift toward one individual whose prior behavior and uncanny knowledge of alleged violations set her apart, Karen. For years, she had been vocal about enforcing HOA standards, even when not officially authorized to do so. Known for her combative tone and persistent monitoring of neighbors' properties, Karen had built a reputation as a self-appointed guardian of neighborhood order. However, what once seemed like overzealous interest in community standards gradually revealed itself as something more strategic and far more calculated. Evidence of Karen's involvement began with patterns. Many of the homes targeted by the fake enforcers were the same ones Karen had previously criticized, either in HOA meetings, community threads, or informal conversations. These properties had little in common aside from being the focus of her persistent complaints. Some had unapproved landscaping choices, slightly off-tone exterior paint, or fences she deemed unsightly. Others were owned by residents who had simply disagreed with her during past disputes or failed to align with her preferences for how the neighborhood should look. The precision with which the enforcers selected these properties indicated insider information, not random patrols. Karen's access to community documents, particularly public HOA directories and past violation reports, placed her in a position to exploit structural weaknesses in the neighborhood's enforcement procedures. She had long maintained copies of the HOA handbook, often citing specific clauses in conversations with neighbors, even if her interpretations stretched far beyond their intended scope. Her familiarity with the bylaws, combined with her position as a vocal community member, gave her credibility she was able to use as a shield while the scam unfolded. Further scrutiny revealed a timeline that strongly correlated with Karen's failed attempts to challenge the fence construction. After exhausting formal complaints through the HOA and receiving confirmation that the project had been approved, she appeared to retreat briefly. It was during this lull that the so-called enforcement division began its activities. The coincidence was difficult to ignore. The same week Karen ceased her direct efforts, the enforcers began issuing citations under a different authority. Interpersonal connections also pointed to her deeper involvement. One of the men impersonating an HOA officer was identified by a neighbor as someone who had previously been seen doing yard work at Karen's house. Another had been spotted entering her property multiple times over the previous months. Although casual relationships between residents and local workers were common, the timing of their interactions raised questions, especially when paired with their role in the enforcement scheme. These connections became more suspicious when it was discovered that Karen had made electronic payments to at least two of the individuals involved, listed under vague service descriptions. Digital communication records further implicated her in the operation. In a group chat with a few neighbors, Karen had made offhand remarks about cleaning up the street and that changes were coming for those who ignored the rules. At the time, these comments were brushed off as typical hyperbole, but in hindsight, they carried a different weight. Additionally, several residents reported receiving anonymous notes or unsigned warnings just prior to the enforcers' visits, notes that mirrored language Karen had used in prior complaints. Karen also attempted to control the narrative as skepticism spread. When residents began questioning the legitimacy of the enforcement team, she became one of the loudest voices defending their presence. She claimed the HOA had been forced to hire outside contractors due to an increase in noncompliance and delays in formal processing. She insisted that the enforcers were merely following orders and that any refusal to cooperate would only result in higher fines later. These assertions, however, were never backed by official HOA communications and only served to deepen the distrust. As residents communicated more openly with one another, the inconsistencies in Karen's statements became increasingly evident. Her claims of HOA coordination were not corroborated by board members. Her assertion that new rules had been passed quietly was directly refuted by HOA meeting minutes. When confronted with these contradictions, Karen deflected, accusing others of negligence or claiming she was simply trying to help the community. Karen's attempt to maintain plausible deniability was undermined by the growing volume of circumstantial evidence. The alignment of targeted properties, the digital and financial trails, the connections to the impersonators, and her aggressive advocacy for the enforcement campaign painted a portrait of calculated manipulation. She had created a situation where others acted on her behalf, but the control clearly originated from her hand. This allowed her to avoid immediate blame while others carried out the intimidation and pressure. The fallout from these revelations was swift. Residents who had once tolerated or ignored Karen's overreach now viewed her actions through the lens of premeditated deceit. Her influence over neighborhood dynamics, once maintained through fear and perceived authority, began to crumble. The community, now aware of the extent of the manipulation, no longer saw her as a concerned citizen, but as the architect of a campaign designed to enforce personal preferences through deception and coercion. Karen's role behind the curtain was not simply that of an instigator, it was that of a strategist. She engineered a false sense of authority, weaponized community standards for personal use, and manipulated perceptions to maintain control. The exposure of her involvement marked a critical turning point in the unraveling of the enforcement scam and the beginning of her public accountability. As the fake enforcement campaign continued, small cracks began to appear in the operation's foundation. What had initially seemed like a coordinated effort by a legitimate HOA authority began to unravel under closer inspection. Several residents, growing uneasy with the citations and questionable tactics, began taking a more critical look at the situation. Their scrutiny, coupled with inconsistencies in the enforcer's behavior and documentation, gradually exposed a web of deception that implicated more than just unauthorized patrols. It pointed directly back to Karen and her behind-the-scenes orchestration. The first significant clue emerged when residents attempted to verify the citations they had received. Typically, HOA fines and notices followed a well-documented process. Official warnings were mailed, often accompanied by photographs, and came from the HOA board or its approved management company. However, the citations from the so-called enforcement officers had no traceable letterhead, contact information, or record with the HOA. Some notices referenced rule numbers that did not exist or used vague legal-sounding terminology not found in the official HOA handbook. The absence of standard formatting raised immediate questions about authenticity. Further investigation revealed that no board meetings had occurred to authorize this kind of enforcement. Meeting minutes, which are public and required for accountability, contained no discussion of hiring third-party agents or launching a special compliance operation. When concerned residents reached out directly to HOA board members, most were surprised to hear about the patrols. One board member openly admitted they had no knowledge of the citations being distributed, nor had they approved or budgeted for any external enforcement action. This contradiction created a ripple of doubt that spread quickly through the neighborhood. Another red flag emerged from discrepancies in the timeline. Multiple homeowners noted that the fake enforcement campaign began shortly after Karen's failed efforts to have the fence removed through official channels. In fact, several of the earliest properties visited by the impersonators had been previously targeted by Karen's informal complaints. The connection between her prior grievances and the citation pattern was too consistent to ignore. It indicated foreknowledge of which properties would be visited and suggested a hand in selecting them. The uniforms worn by the enforcers also came under scrutiny. Though they appeared semi-professional at a glance, closer examination revealed that the logos were generic and had no affiliation with the actual HOA. The polo shirts bore a fabricated emblem that mimicked official branding but did not match any known design used by the HOA or its legal management company. Some residents began capturing photos discreetly, comparing them to known HOA materials, which only deepened the suspicion. A major turning point came when one homeowner, who had refused to comply with a questionable citation, installed a security camera to monitor follow-up visits. The footage captured one of the officers behaving suspiciously, including failing to knock on the door or leave official documents before retreating quickly. Using facial recognition software on social media and local service directories, tech-savvy neighbors were able to identify one of the individuals as a local handyman who had previously worked at Karen's residence. This discovery triggered a wider digital search, linking multiple so-called enforcers to Karen through past engagements and online interactions. When residents began comparing citation documents across multiple households, they found that the language used was identical, not just in structure, but in phrasing and formatting. Typos, grammar patterns, and even the fonts matched across all citations, suggesting they had been produced using the same template. Some citations contained digital watermarks that led back to a widely available citation template used for novelty purposes, not any government or corporate source. These findings reinforced the theory that the citations were manufactured rather than issued through a legitimate regulatory body. Another layer of exposure came from financial irregularities. At least 2 residents who attempted to comply with fines reported being given payment envelopes with no clear destination or address. When they questioned where the money was going, they were told it would be processed internally by HOA administration, but no receipts were issued. One homeowner, unwilling to pay in cash, requested digital payment options and was instructed to send money to a generic email linked to a digital wallet. Upon investigation, the account was discovered to be registered under a name that was only 1 letter off from Karen's legal name, likely an intentional move to avoid immediate detection. Social dynamics in the neighborhood also shifted. People who had previously dismissed Karen's involvement began to reconsider after noticing how defensive and controlling she became in discussions. When residents raised concerns in the community group chat, Karen responded aggressively, often accusing them of ignorance or suggesting they were trying to undermine order. Her inability to provide verifiable sources for her claims or produce any correspondence from the HOA board only worsened her credibility. The consequences of these discoveries were substantial. Residents began organizing formal complaints, submitting reports to the actual HOA board, and requesting an emergency community meeting. Some even contacted local authorities, citing potential fraud, impersonation of officials, and harassment. The HOA, in turn, launched its own investigation, publicly denying any affiliation with the enforcement campaign and encouraging residents to disregard the unauthorized citations. In the span of just a few weeks, a manufactured narrative built on fear, misinformation, and false authority was dismantled by a community unwilling to be manipulated. The clues had always been there: misaligned documents, inconsistent procedures, and Karen's overly detailed knowledge of violations that had never been publicly addressed. Once residents began connecting the dots, the full extent of the deception could no longer be concealed. This phase marked a critical juncture in the story. Karen's carefully constructed web of control was rapidly disintegrating under the weight of truth. What had once been a silent power play masked as rule enforcement was now exposed as deliberate misconduct with far-reaching consequences. The unraveling of the enforcement scam reached its climax when the mounting evidence became impossible to ignore or deflect. Karen's orchestration of the fake HOA crackdown, long suspected and whispered about, was formally exposed through a combination of resident action, digital investigation, and official inquiry. What began as scattered doubts among individual homeowners evolved into a coordinated effort to reveal the full extent of the deception and ensure accountability. The neighborhood, once caught in a fog of intimidation and misinformation, now turned its attention to justice. The Homeowners Association, under pressure from a growing number of complaints, convened an emergency meeting. This meeting marked the first official acknowledgement that something had gone fundamentally wrong in the community. The board issued a public statement disavowing any connection to the HOA Enforcement Division, confirming that no such team had been authorized or funded. More importantly, they acknowledged that residents had been targeted by individuals impersonating authority figures and distributing fraudulent citations. A major breakthrough came when a tech-savvy resident compiled and presented a comprehensive dossier linking Karen to the impersonators. The report included photographic evidence, screenshots of group chats, payment transactions, and a timeline that aligned the emergence of the enforcers with Karen's prior complaints. The most damning piece was the identification of the primary fake officer as someone with a direct financial connection to Karen, verified through digital payment platforms. This level of detail left little room for plausible denial. Public opinion shifted swiftly and decisively. Karen, once seen by some as merely overzealous, was now viewed as the instigator of a deliberate campaign of harassment. Her actions were no longer interpreted as misguided enthusiasm for neighborhood standards, but as a calculated attempt to impose personal will through deception and coercion. The community that had tolerated her micromanagement and tolerated her presence in discussions about aesthetics and compliance now rejected her authority outright. Multiple residents who had been issued fraudulent citations came forward to give statements. Some recounted being pressured into making property changes under false pretenses. Others admitted to paying fines, believing them to be legitimate, only to realize later they had been deceived. These testimonies were crucial in building a case not only within the HOA, but also with local law enforcement. Fraud, impersonation of authority, and extortion were now part of the legal conversation surrounding the incident. The HOA's legal counsel coordinated with authorities to initiate an investigation. While Karen attempted to defend herself by claiming she had only advised the individuals involved and had no control over their actions, her explanation was weakened by the financial transactions, communication trails, and witness accounts. Her access to HOA documents and her history of targeting specific residents demonstrated intent and foreknowledge, both of which supported claims of complicity. The enforcers themselves, once confronted by police, quickly distanced themselves from the operation, stating they were hired under the impression that they were performing legitimate compliance checks. However, interviews revealed that no contracts had been signed, no credentials provided, and no formal authorization given. At best, they were acting under negligent assumptions. At worst, they were co-conspirators. Legal consequences for them varied, depending on individual roles, but several faced charges related to impersonation, harassment, and solicitation of fraudulent fines. Karen's standing in the community deteriorated further. Petitions were circulated to bar her from participating in any future HOA decisions, citing ethical violations and damage to communal trust. While she had never held a formal position on the board, her influence had been significant due to her vocal nature and persistent involvement. That influence was now entirely eroded. Attempts to defend her actions on community forums were met with overwhelming backlash. The neighborhood, having seen the true cost of her interference, was unwilling to entertain further justifications. Restitution became a key part of the resolution process. The HOA worked to reimburse affected residents who had paid fake fines and provided resources to restore property changes made under duress. Workshops were held to educate residents on how to verify legitimate HOA communication and recognize red flags in future enforcement activities. Additionally, the HOA adopted stricter protocols regarding third-party engagement, ensuring that no external individuals could claim authority without verified documentation and board approval. Karen herself faced legal consequences, both civil and criminal. A civil suit was filed by several residents seeking damages for stress, financial loss, and property devaluation. Criminal charges, while still under investigation, included impersonation, fraud, and conspiracy to commit harassment. The full outcome of the legal process remained pending, but the public exposure and social consequences were immediate and lasting. Karen was no longer a feared or influential figure. She was an example of what happens when personal vendettas are masked as community concern. The broader impact of the incident reshaped the neighborhood's approach to governance and transparency. Trust, once fractured, began to rebuild through collaboration and increased resident engagement. The community adopted a more inclusive model for decision-making, welcoming diverse perspectives, and focusing on communication over control. What had been a battleground for aesthetic micromanagement became a space for mutual respect and shared responsibility. Ultimately, justice was not just about exposing Karen. It was about reclaiming the sense of agency and fairness that had been stolen through deceit. The residents' collective action sent a clear message. No individual, no matter how persistent or persuasive, would be allowed to manipulate the system for personal power. The HOA, the neighborhood, and the homeowners themselves emerged stronger, more united, and better prepared to protect the integrity of their community going forward. Fire Karen got exposed, justice was served, and the neighborhood took its power back. But stories like these are just the beginning. If you enjoyed this twist-filled saga and want more real-life showdowns where the truth rises and entitled behavior gets checked, subscribe to Expect Stories right now. Thumbs up, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video if you believe no one is above the rules, not even a self-appointed neighborhood queen. Bell turn on notifications so you never miss the next jaw-dropping tale where the truth always finds a way out. Expect Stories, where drama meets justice, and every episode exposes the unexpected.